Hello there, and welcome to our first peel back of history. Maybe you're lying in bed, studying, or simply wanting a bit of background noise. Well, we've got you covered. If you like hearing stories of the people, and in this case, warriors who came before us, I'd be honoured if you subscribe to hear more of the tales we have to offer. Now make yourself comfortable, as tonight we'll be discovering why it was horrible fighting for the Roman Empire. Part 1. The life of a Roman soldier. They called it glory. They told tales of empire, conquest, and civilization carved into the wild edges of the world. But behind every Roman victory was the shattered body of a soldier. A man who slept in mud, marched until his legs bled, and killed in such close quarters that his enemy's breath was the last thing he heard. This isn't the story Rome wanted you to remember. This is the story of the men who actually fought the wars. The grunts, the legionaries, the broken and brutalized machines of war that kept the empire alive, and often died in the process. Because the truth is, it was horrible fighting in the Roman Empire. Forget Hollywood armour and gleaming swords. This was not a life of honour and heroism. It was a grind of sweat, blood, fear, and endless pain. You didn't just risk death on the battlefield. You suffered long before you ever got there. And if you survived the wars, you were never the same. In the next 2 hours, we're going to break down exactly what it meant to fight for Rome. Not from the comfort of a marble Senate hall, but from the dirt roads, forests, deserts, and frozen frontiers where men were pushed past the limits of human endurance. This is not the myth, this is the nightmare. You didn't just join the Roman army, you surrendered your future to it. If you were lucky, you volunteered. If not, you were conscripted, pulled from your farm, your family, your life, and dropped into a world of violence. You swore the sacramentum, an oath not just of loyalty, but obedience unto death. Disobedience wasn't punished with a warning, it was punished with a beating, or worse. From that moment on, your body belonged to Rome. 25 years. That's how long you were expected to serve. 25 years of war, disease, starvation, freezing winters, and burning deserts. Your first months were hell. Forget any modern idea of basic training. Roman training was designed to break you, and if you didn't survive it, you weren't worth the food rations anyway. You marched up to 30 kilometers a day, in full gear, under blazing sun or pouring rain. You drilled in formation for hours, holding a scutum shield that weighed nearly 10 kilograms. Your sword? It wasn't light either. The gladius was short, for close killing, and the wooden version used in training was intentionally heavier, to build muscle and wear you down. And the punishments for failure? Brutal. Slack off in drills, and you might be flogged in front of your entire cohort. Sleep during watch, beaten, lose your weapon. You're digging latrines for months or worse, flogged half to death. This was a machine that forged men into killers, or destroyed them in the attempt. Roman discipline was legendary, not because it was efficient, but because it was terrifying. They had a punishment so extreme it still shocks historians: decimation. If your unit showed cowardice or failed in battle, the punishment was simple. 1 in 10 men, chosen at random, was beaten to death by the other 9. No trial, no appeal. Just bludgeoned to death with stones and clubs by your own brothers in arms. It kept you in line, but it also ensured that fear was always with you. Not just fear of the enemy, but fear of your own command. Hollywood loves to show Roman soldiers in polished breastplates and red capes. What they don't show is how miserable it was to wear that armour all day. The larica segmentata, iconic Roman segmented armour, was tight, stiff, and heavy. With your helmet, shield, weapons, rations, And entrenching tools, you could carry up to 60 pounds, 27 kilograms of gear on a daily march. You weren't just a soldier, you were a walking fortress, expected to dig ditches, build palisades, carry wood, construct camps, and defend them every single day. Every evening, the entire army would build a fortified camp, digging trenches, building ramparts, setting sentries. No exceptions. Even after a full day of marching or fighting, there was no rest, only the illusion of it. When you weren't training, marching, or fighting, you were waiting. Roman soldiers often spent weeks or months in camp between campaigns, living in cramped tents with 7 other men. Disease ran rampant, latrines overflowed, food spoiled, fights broke out. There was little comfort. You slept on straw if you were lucky. You were always dirty, always tired, and never safe, not even from your own commanders. And if you wanted to complain, too bad. Rome didn't need complainers. Rome needed obedience. This was the starting point. Not the battlefield, not the glory, just survival inside the machine. And if you thought this was bad, wait until they sent you into combat. Part 2. Brutality on the battlefield. On the surface, a Roman battle looked like clockwork. Legions forming perfect lines, shields locking in formation, standards raised, a symphony of discipline. But that's a lie, because once the first javelins flew, order broke down. The ground shook. Men screamed, steel hit flesh, and every soldier, every single one, was left to fight alone. The shield wall might last minutes. After that, it was a knife fight in hell. Rome didn't just arm its soldiers to kill, it armed them to mutilate. The pilum, a heavy throwing spear, wasn't just made to pierce, it was designed to bend on impact, so it couldn't be thrown back. And it would lodge deep into shields, rendering them useless. Then came the gladius, the Roman short sword. Small, yes, but in the chaos of battle, it was perfect. Not for elegant swordplay, but for brutal stabs into guts, throats, groins, the softest, deadliest places. The scutum, the massive rectangular shield, could bash in a skull just as well as block a spear. Rome trained you not just to fight, but to destroy. Imagine this. You're shoulder to shoulder in a packed formation. The enemy charges. You throw your pilum, and now it's just your sword and shield. You can't see more than a foot ahead. You hear metal, breaking bones, screaming. Blood splashes your face. You don't know if it's yours. And then you fight. Not with strategy, with panic. You lunge, stab, bash, scream. You try to stay alive for just one more second. You slip in the mud. Someone stumbles into you. You smell piss, shit, blood. The stench is overwhelming. Your comrade next to you gets his throat cut. He falls. You close the gap. No time to grieve. No time to think. Just survive. This wasn't some elegant clash of civilizations. It was a meat grinder. You think the worst part of battle is being killed. But many Roman soldiers didn't die in the fight. They collapsed during it. Combat lasted hours. You swung your sword again and again, your arms screaming, your lungs burning, your legs shaking. Your body gave out long before your will. And when it did, you were done. Not because of a wound, but because you simply couldn't move anymore. That's when the enemy killed you. On your knees, face down, too tired to even lift your shield. In the Teutoburg forest, 3 Roman legions were ambushed by Germanic tribes. Trapped in dense woods, unable to form lines, they were hunted like animals. Rain poured, mud swallowed sandals, supply lines were cut. One soldier described it as like being eaten alive by the forest. The Germans didn't just kill the Romans, They tortured them. They nailed officers to trees, cut out their eyes, slit their throats, and let them bleed into the dirt. It was one of Rome's worst defeats, and it taught every soldier a terrifying lesson. Rome might abandon you. There was no guarantee of rescue or glory, just death. Roman medicine was primitive. If you were wounded on the battlefield, your chances of survival were horrific. There were no painkillers, no antiseptics. A gash meant infection. A broken limb meant months of agony, if not amputation. And amputations, done with a saw, no anaesthesia, just a rag to bite down on. Some soldiers were burned to cauterize wounds, others simply died from shock. And yet, somehow, that was the best case scenario. Because if your wounds weren't fatal, your own army might leave you behind anyway. There was no word for PTSD in Latin, but it existed, and it destroyed men. Some soldiers went silent for weeks after battles. Others couldn't sleep, afraid of what they'd see when they closed their eyes. Veterans were known to lash out, to isolate, to drink themselves into oblivion, if they could find wine. The Romans didn't care. You were expected to move on, to fight again, to suppress the memories of the friend whose guts spilled onto your sandals, of the screams, of the smell, of the nightmares that never left. Rome told its soldiers the enemy was savage, that they were fighting for civilization, against chaos. But many enemies were just like them, terrified, angry, defending their homes, and they fought like demons, because they had to. They weren't trained in formations, but they knew the terrain. They knew where to ambush, when to strike, and how to disappear into the forests. They didn't fight to conquer. They fought because they were cornered. And when they did win, they often showed no mercy, because they knew Rome would have done the same. Let's say you won. You survived the charge, the clash, the killing. Now what? You spent the next hours cleaning up corpses, burying the dead, finishing off the wounded, looting your own fallen comrades. You didn't get a feast, you got silence, and the echo of screams still ringing in your head. Victory didn't bring joy, it brought survivor's guilt, and the dread of knowing you'd have to do it again. This was Roman warfare, not heroic, not glorious, just a factory of violence that chewed up men and spit out whatever was left. And still, the worst wasn't behind you, because when you weren't dying in combat, you were dying on the march. Part 3. Enemy Tactics and Horrors. Rome sold its people a myth that its enemies were savages, uncivilized, untrained, inferior, just wild beasts waiting to be tamed by steel and order. But that myth ended the moment a Roman soldier left the safety of a fortified camp. Because in the forests, the hills, the swamps and deserts, Rome was the outsider. And their enemies, they knew the land, they knew the weaknesses, and they knew how to make Roman soldiers suffer. No Roman soldier feared a frontal assault, but an ambush, that was pure terror. Enemy tribes like the Germany or Britons didn't wait in nice, open fields. They struck from the woods, from ravines, from behind false retreats. Your column might be marching peacefully. Then suddenly all hell broke loose. A volley of javelins, trees shaking, screams from the front. You couldn't form ranks, you couldn't even see the enemy. And worst of all, you knew that once the formation broke, you were dead. One of the most feared tactics was the feigned retreat. A group of enemy skirmishers would run from Roman lines, only to lure them into a trap, where hidden warriors waited in dense terrain. The Romans fell for it, many times. Some enemies didn't just want to defeat Rome, they wanted to psychologically destroy its soldiers. Tribes like the Gauls and Dacians used fear as a tactic. They painted their bodies, screamed in war cries, and charged in a frenzy, sometimes stark naked. It wasn't just for show, it worked. Imagine facing a wall of screaming, painted men in the fog, drums pounding behind them, blood already on their axes. Some Roman soldiers broke before the first clash, and the Parthians, they brought a different kind of terror. You never even saw their faces, only waves of arrows raining down from distant cavalry. You couldn't reach them, you couldn't escape, only die slowly, one shot at a time. We have to come back to Teutoburg, because it's the ultimate example of enemy horror. It was supposed to be a peaceful escort mission. Instead it became a massacre. 3 legions, nearly 20,000 men, led into a twisting forest by a friendly German guide who turned on them. For days the Romans were hunted. They couldn't form lines. Their wagons got stuck in the mud. Their officers panicked, and the Germans cut them down, bit by bit. Some tried to flee, others surrendered. It didn't matter. Many were tortured, sacrificed, or nailed to trees as warnings. By the end, almost no one survived. When the Emperor Augustus heard the news, he reportedly beat his head against the wall, crying, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." He never got them back. Rome expected its enemies to fight fair. They rarely did. Many used scorched earth tactics, burning their own land to deny Roman forces food or shelter. They poisoned wells, hid their families, booby-trapped trails. To Roman soldiers, this wasn't war. It was starvation in enemy country. It was marching through nothing, for days under enemy shadow. And when the enemies did strike, they showed no mercy. Captured Romans were tortured, paraded, even sacrificed to pagan gods. To some tribes, Roman armour was a trophy. To others, Roman heads were currency. This wasn't just resistance, it was revenge. But here's the hardest truth. To many of these people, Rome was the monster. Roman armies burned villages, crucified rebels, enslaved entire populations. So when these enemies fought back with fury, when they ambushed, slaughtered and mutilated Roman soldiers, it wasn't savagery, it was survival. And if a Roman soldier was captured, he was the invader. He was the face of the empire that tore their world apart. What followed was rarely mercy. The enemy wasn't weak. The enemy wasn't stupid. The enemy was waiting. And to the Roman soldier, that was more terrifying than death. Because at least in death, you stopped running. Part 4. Marching through hell. If you were a Roman soldier, you didn't get to fight and go home. You marched, endlessly. You crossed mountains, deserts, marshes and frozen plains, thousands of kilometres from the warm cities of Italy. Each step wasn't progress, it was punishment. You carried 30 kilograms of gear on your back, weapons, armour, a shovel, rations, your bedroll, even tools to build the camp. You were known as a Marius mule, because to Rome you were as useful and disposable as a beast of burden. Rome built great roads, but they didn't build comfort. Roads cut through everything, searing hot plains, swampy deltas, forests choked with insects, high-altitude passes where snow never melted. Soldiers marched for 10 hours a day, sometimes longer, and if the terrain was bad, you didn't stop. You pushed through it. Your feet blistered and bled. Your legs cramped. Your shoulders burned. You drank from muddy puddles or snow melt, if there was anything at all. The pace was brutal. If you fell behind, you might be beaten, you might be left, or you might just collapse and die alone. And when the day's march ended, you didn't rest. You built a fortress, every single night. The Roman army didn't sleep in the open. It didn't take chances. It dug ditches, built palisades, planted stakes, posted guards. And who built all that? You. Even after marching all day, soldiers were required to dig, hammer, saw and lift, often in freezing rain, or burning sun, or wind that froze your spit before it hit the ground. Skip the camp work. Expect a flogging. Too slow? More work tomorrow. This wasn't strategy. It was survival through exhaustion. Rome's enemies were terrifying. But the weather? It broke men in ways swords never could. In Britannia, rain fell for weeks without stopping. Tents rotted. Fires wouldn't light. Feet got infected from the cold and damp. Frostbite took fingers. You wrapped your legs in rags and prayed. In the deserts of Syria or Africa, it was the opposite. The sun cooked you alive in your armour. Sand blew into your eyes, your mouth, your wounds. There was no water, just rationed sips of warm vinegar and sweat. You weren't a warrior anymore. You were just a man being slowly unmade by the land itself. The further from Rome you marched, the worse the food became. Rations were dry, mouldy and minimal. Some hardtack bread, a bit of dried meat, maybe sour wine if you were lucky. And if the supply wagons didn't arrive, you went hungry. You'd forage, steal from locals, or boil roots. But starvation was always lurking. Soldiers died before battles even began, malnourished, too weak to fight, passing out on the march. And if your army was cut off, like in the Jewish revolt or during Parthian campaigns, hunger turned to madness. There are accounts of soldiers eating leather straps, animal dung, even each other. But no killer was more common or more miserable than disease. When you packed thousands of men into a cramped camp with poor sanitation, no clean water and spoiled rations, it was inevitable. Dysentery was rampant. You could crap yourself to death in 2 days. Fevers burned through whole cohorts. Lice, fleas and infections were constant. There was no medicine, just folk remedies and prayer. And worst of all, if you were too sick to march, you weren't carried. You were left. Rome loved maps, but the average soldier had no idea where he was going. He was sent into unknown lands against unknown enemies to fight for reasons he didn't understand. Every village was a potential ambush. Every shadowed hilltop could hide javelins. Every new order could mean another week of marching into nowhere. You weren't just walking to war, you were walking towards something nameless, faceless, and waiting. By the time you reached the battlefield, you were already broken. Your feet were raw, your skin was cracked. You hadn't slept properly in weeks. Your brothers were already dead to illness, exhaustion, desertion, or despair. And then someone blew the horn, and you had to fight. Not because you wanted to, but because the only thing worse than battle was what waited behind you if you refused it. This was the reality of marching for Rome. It wasn't just war that killed you, it was the road itself. And if you survived the journey, you still had to fight a war Rome might not even remember. Part 5. Rome turns on its own. To Rome, you were a tool, a cog in the war machine, a sword, a shield, a shovel, but not a person. Rome didn't fight for you. You fought for Rome. And if you died, another body would take your place. No name, no monument. The Republic used its soldiers. The Empire discarded them. Rome's generals made promises. Land, glory, citizenship, gold. But when the wars were over, the promises vanished. Veterans who bled for the Republic often came home to find their lands seized, their pensions unpaid, their names forgotten. After decades of service, many were left to beg in the very cities they thought they'd fought to protect. And if you asked too loudly for your reward, you were branded a traitor. Sometimes the soldiers had enough. The mutiny of 14 AD, right after Augustus died, was one of the most terrifying moments in Roman military history. Tiberius had taken power. The legions in Pannonia and Germania revolted. Why? Because they were promised better pay, shorter service, fairer treatment. They got nothing. So they rose up. They killed their commanders. They marched on Roman cities. They demanded justice. But justice never came. Tiberius sent his son, Germanicus, to calm the troops. And how did he do it? He gave them bribes, then silenced them. The rebellion ended in blood and guilt, and everyone involved was quietly replaced or punished. Rome never forgot mutineers, but it wasn't just the soldiers who feared Rome. Rome feared them, because a loyal legion was powerful, but a disloyal one? That was a kingmaker. Emperors rose and fell by the sword. Some were made by the legions, others were torn apart by them. The result? An empire drowning in paranoia. Commanders were executed for being too popular. Veterans were disarmed after victory, just in case. Entire legions were sent on suicide campaigns, to die, not to win. Because if you lived long enough to become a threat, Rome would kill you first. In times of peace, Rome sent its soldiers to conquer. In times of crisis, it sent them to slaughter each other. Roman civil wars weren't rare, they were routine. Caesar versus Pompey, Octavian versus Antony, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian, the year of the 4 emperors, Constantine versus Maxentius, and dozens more. Each time legions marched not against foreign enemies, but against other Romans. You didn't just fight strangers, you fought old allies, brothers from shared campaigns, men who wore the same eagle on their shields, until yesterday. There was no glory in these wars, only confusion, grief, and betrayal. And at the heart of Rome's rot stood the Praetorian Guard. They were the emperor's personal enforcers, elite, untouchable, feared. But loyalty? That could be bought. Praetorians assassinated emperors they swore to protect. They auctioned the throne to the highest bidder. They executed generals, senators, even innocent citizens without question. To a common soldier, the Praetorians were everything wrong with Rome. Well-fed, politicised, corrupt. They didn't bleed in the mud. They drank wine in marble halls. But if a legion rose up or questioned authority, the Praetorians crushed it. You could fight your whole life for the empire and be strangled in a dungeon by the men who never stepped onto a battlefield. There's a Latin phrase you rarely hear. Roma devorat suos. Rome devours its own. It promises honour, but it rewards silence. It demands loyalty, but it gives none in return. Even great generals, Scipio, Germanicus, Agricola, found themselves exiled, poisoned, or erased. No matter how high you climbed, Rome always had a knife waiting. And if it wasn't the emperor's blade, it was a dagger from your rival, or poison in your wine, or exile to some frozen frontier, to die quietly, forgotten. You didn't just fight for Rome, you fought against it. Against its betrayal, against its fear, against its own hunger for power and blood. In the end, the Roman soldier didn't die for glory. He died because his empire made him expendable. And if he spoke out, he disappeared. Part 6. The Cost of Victory. Surviving a Roman war wasn't a blessing. It was a curse you carried for the rest of your life. You survived the marches, the battles, the mutinies, the hunger, the fear. But Rome didn't heal you. It didn't help you. It used you, and then let you rot. You dreamed of coming home, but when you did, no one remembered your name. No one remembered your sacrifice. No one cared. You were promised land, but the land had been sold off to senators. You were promised a pension, but the treasury was empty again. You were promised honour, but honour didn't feed your children. So you did what many veterans did. You begged, you drank, or you joined another war, because it was the only place you still mattered. The body can heal, but the mind, Roman soldiers lived with what we'd now call PTSD, though they had no name for it. They'd seen beheadings, mass executions, rape, torture, betrayals, friends dying screaming in their arms. They dreamed of blood. They flinched at loud noises. Some lashed out. Others went silent. Many took their own lives, quietly, without ceremony, because they didn't just leave part of themselves on the battlefield. They left all of it. Some veterans didn't just suffer, they fought back. In the 1st century BCE, Rome was overflowing with angry armed veterans who had received nothing. Many joined Spartacus, others joined Catiline's conspiracy. Still others became mercenaries, thieves, or even rebels against Rome itself. And in the provinces, entire veteran colonies revolted. They didn't want revenge, they wanted what they were owed. Rome responded with what it always did: more violence, more silence, more forgetting. Rome celebrated its soldiers in art, in speeches, in ceremony. But that soldier was a fiction. He was always young, always noble, always dying for the Republic or the Emperor. The real soldier? He was broken, dirty, scared, often angry, often ashamed. But Rome didn't want him on the statues. It wanted the myth, not the man. For many veterans, peace was worse than war, because they didn't know how to live without fear, without orders, without structure. So they re-enlisted, or took jobs as guards, bounty hunters, or killers for hire. And if you lived long enough, you became a ghost, a hollow-eyed figure wandering taverns and markets, armour rusted, stories ignored, waiting for one more fight that never came. Rome built monuments to emperors, to senators, to generals, but to the soldier, nothing. Most were buried where they fell. Mass graves, forgotten fields, no inscriptions, no funerals, no family. You could fight for 25 years, win a dozen battles, bleed for every inch of the empire, and die as nothing more than a number. Because to Rome the cost of victory wasn't gold, it was you. Victory made Rome strong, but it made its soldiers disappear. And in the end, that was the greatest cruelty of all. Part 7. Life in the Legion. When you joined the Roman Legion, you didn't sign a contract. You gave away your life, your identity, gone. Your name, forgotten in the records. You were no longer a man. You were a unit, a tool, a moving part in a war machine, older than your family, larger than your world. From that day forward, everything, your food, your thoughts, your steps, even your emotions, belonged to Rome. A Roman legionary didn't just exist, he was programmed. Every day followed a strict routine, no matter where you were. Wake at dawn, drill, equipment inspection, clean weapons, fortify the camp, eat, drill again, patrol, write reports, stand watch, sleep if allowed. And if you messed up even once, there was no warning, only punishment. The Roman army ran on fear. Fear of the enemy, fear of failure, but mostly fear of your own commanders. Punishments were brutal, public, and often lethal. Fall asleep on watch, you could be beaten to death by your own unit. Disobey a direct order, flogging, branding, execution. Cowardice in battle, you might be crucified. And if an entire unit failed, The worst punishment of all? Decimation. 1 in every 10 men, chosen by lot, beaten to death by their comrades, not to discipline the guilty, but to terrify the innocent. And yet, in all that misery, a strange thing happened. You bonded, not out of love, not out of choice, but out of shared suffering. You marched together, ate the same rotten bread, shared lice, fought shoulder to shoulder, bled into the same soil. That kind of pain fused men together. You didn't fight for Rome anymore. You fought for the man next to you. Because in the Legion, brotherhood wasn't optional. It was survival. Roman soldiers were tough, but they were also superstitious to the core. Before battle, sacrifices were made, entrails read, omens interpreted. A bird flying the wrong way could delay an invasion. A dream could spark terror in an entire cohort. They carried personal gods, charms, bones, rings, anything that gave a sense of control in a world ruled by chaos. Even the act of sharpening your blade could become a ritual. Because once the fighting started, the gods were the only ones still listening. Free time in the Legion? It was rare, and it was dangerous. Idle soldiers meant unrest, fights, or desertion. So even on off days, you were kept busy. Training, building roads, digging canals, repairing siege equipment, hunting, guard duty. You could gamble, you could drink, you could visit a brothel in the local town, but you were always being watched. One wrong word, one hint of disrespect, and your rest day turned into a disciplinary execution. Despite it all, many legionaries didn't hate the Legion. Some even loved it. Why? Because the Legion gave them structure, purpose, belonging. For peasants from the provinces, it was the first time anyone treated them as part of something greater. They wore the eagle with pride, they marched under banners that meant home, strength, order, and many asked to be buried with their weapons, because they couldn't imagine an afterlife without duty. The Legion didn't just control your body, it rewired your mind. You didn't walk like a civilian, you didn't eat like a civilian, you didn't think like a civilian. Years after discharge, men still woke at first light, still checked their gear, still referred to time in watches, still waited for orders that would never come. Because once you gave yourself to Rome, Rome never gave you back. You weren't just in the Legion was in you. Forever. Part 8. Why they still fought. They were beaten, they were betrayed, they were broken, and yet they still marched, still obeyed, still bled for the empire that left them to rot. Why? Why fight for something that used you? Why die for an empire that wouldn't even remember your name? Because to walk away from Rome was to walk into a void far more terrifying than death. Most legionaries weren't born into power. They came from nothing. Peasants, slaves, orphans, disgraced sons. The Legion didn't just give them a job, it gave them an identity. In that armour you had rank, a name, a position, a purpose. Outside the Legion, you were just another nobody in a world that didn't care if you lived or died. So you stayed, because even a cruel home is still home. And the Legion was the only thing that ever made you feel real. Out here in the dirt and blood, something sacred formed. Not religion, not patriotism, brotherhood. You ate together, fought together, watched each other sleep, stood shoulder to shoulder in the line, waiting to die. And you saw that man beside you as your true family. You didn't fight for Rome, you didn't fight for the Senate. You fought for him, because if you broke ranks, he died. And if he broke ranks, you died. You were chained together, Not by law, but by trust. And that trust was worth dying for. Peace is quiet, but it's not always kind. For a soldier, peace was confusion. No orders, no structure, no battle rhythm, just silence and the memories. In the Legion, every day was brutal, but predictable. You knew what to do, who you were, what came next. In civilian life, there was no next. So many men re-enlisted, not for glory, but because they couldn't function outside the fight. The battlefield was hell, but for some, peace was worse. Rome sold a dream. March under the eagle, and you'll be remembered. Conquer for Caesar, and you'll live forever. Die with honour, and your name will echo in marble halls. It was a lie, but a powerful one. And when you're cold, hungry, scared, that lie becomes everything. The idea that your death might mean something, that your pain might be seen, that your blood might build something eternal, that was enough to keep marching, even if it was all dust in the end. The tribes beyond the border, to the Roman mind they were monsters, unwashed, uncivilized, godless, a threat to your home, your city, your family. That's what the Legion told you, what your officers taught you. And maybe you knew it was exaggerated, but you clung to it anyway. Because when the only alternative to Rome was chaos, you'd rather die under an emperor's boot than live under a barbarian's spear. Fear kept you loyal, because Rome may be cruel, but what waited beyond Rome was worse. After years of war, you stopped fearing death. You stopped hoping to avoid it. You just hoped to control it, to die well, to die with your weapon drawn, to die for something, even if that thing was a lie. A man who's seen death too often becomes its shadow. And in the Legion, death didn't stalk you. It walked beside you. Some men joined the Legion at 16. They marched, fought, slept in tents, ate stale bread, watched 100 friends die. They survived 10, 15, 25 years. They became officers, or grizzled veterans, or just ghosts. And when the discharge papers came, they didn't leave. Because who were they without the Legion? Not a farmer, not a husband, not a merchant. They were Legion. That was the only name that ever mattered. And they would rather die a soldier than live as a man who didn't know how to be anything else. So why did they keep fighting? Because pain was simpler than peace, because fear was quieter than guilt, because brotherhood felt more real than love, because dying with purpose was better than living without it. But mostly because they were Roman soldiers, and to be a Roman soldier was to march into darkness and believe you were carrying the light, even if no one ever remembered your name. Part 9. The Long Shadow of Rome. Rome fell, but the idea of Rome never did. The empire fractured, its banners burned, its cities crumbled, but the image of the Roman soldier, the discipline, the loyalty, the silence, that image survived. It became a blueprint for empires to come, for kings, generals, dictators, anyone who dreamed of power. Because Rome had proven one truth. If you can train men to kill without question, you can rule the world. Every empire since Rome has borrowed its shadow. Napoleon studied Caesar like scripture. Mussolini tried to resurrect the legions in name, uniform, and myth. Hitler's generals used Roman strategy manuals. Even modern militaries echo its command structures, from eagle emblems to parade formations, from stone monuments to the glorification of death in service. Rome taught the world how to worship the soldier, while quietly grinding him into the earth. There is something seductive about it all. The straight lines, the polished armour, the rows of shields locked in perfect unison. It feels orderly, noble, clean, but that's the illusion Rome perfected. Because beneath the discipline, the heroism, the greater good, was a machine that turned men into weapons, and when they were no longer useful, it buried them, quietly, efficiently, without guilt. Modern stories remember the glory, the victories, the strategies, the legends. They show the eagle standards, the crisp salutes, the climactic final stand. But they forget the suffering. They forget the frostbite in Germania, the diseases in Judea, the desertions in Gaul, the screams during decimation, the empty eyes of the veterans left to beg outside Roman baths. History is written by victors, but it is lived by the broken. Rome told its soldiers, "Your sacrifice is noble. Your death will be remembered. You are part of something eternal." And today, we say the same things. To soldiers, to citizens, to ourselves. The armour looks different, the flags have changed. But the myth is the same, that suffering for the state is beautiful, that violence is honourable when it's ordered, that those who kill for empire are heroes, even when the empire forgets them. So let us remember not the myth, not the monuments, not the marble gods. Let us remember the men. The 17-year-old recruit who cried the first night in camp, the centurion who carried his wounded men across a river under arrows, the deserter who fled, not from cowardice, but because he missed his child, the veteran who returned home after 20 years and found his land stolen. Let us remember them, because they were never symbols, never statues, never legends. They were human, and their pain deserves to be seen. The empire is dust now, its banners faded, its eagles buried, its gods silent. But the shadow it cast still falls across our world, in every uniformed march, every flag raised over conquered soil, every promise made to a young soldier that he will be remembered. Rome is gone, but the cost of fighting for it still echoes. Not all who served Rome made it into the history books. Some died in silence, beneath the trees of forgotten forests. Some were buried where the sand swallowed their names. Some came home, but not all of them truly returned. We look back at Rome, and we see statues, polished marble, stone eyes, perfect bodies frozen in time. We call them heroes. We give them names. We imagine them as gods among men. But that was never the truth. The Roman soldier was not a statue. He was flesh, fearful, mortal, and forgotten. He bled. He cried. He begged. He hoped. He watched friends die in puddles of blood and piss, and prayed it wouldn't be his turn next. Please let it not be me. Please let me see the sun tomorrow. The boy from the farm, he didn't know what Rome was. He knew sheep and dust and the sound of his mother's singing at night. He joined for food, for adventure, because the recruiter promised him coin and citizenship. He marched for weeks. He killed men he had never met. He watched friends break under cold rain and foreign screams. When he came home 10 years later, his house was gone, his fields sold, his parents dead. And Rome didn't remember him, the centurion who buried them all. He was the best of them. He trained harder, he spoke little, he kept order when others wept. He had 27 scars and still stood straight. Rome needs you strong, they told him. Hold the line. And he did. Through Gaul, through Parthia, through plague, through mutiny. Until one night, sitting by a fire, he counted the faces of every man he had lost. 93. He remembered each name, each scream, each funeral. But not one of those men was remembered by Rome. Only the victories were written down. Never the men. The one who ran. They called him a coward. He ran from battle. They caught him 2 days later. He didn't beg. He just said, "I didn't run because I feared the enemy. I ran because I hadn't seen my son in 6 years. And I didn't want to die before I remembered the colour of his eyes." They beat him, tied him to a post, and left him for the crows. Rome didn't record his name, but we should remember it. Even cowards bleed. Letters never read. We found them. Scraps of parchment in old forts, faded Latin, tear stains, letters from soldiers to wives, sons, fathers, mothers. The food is foul, but I eat. My boots are rotted, but I march. Tell my brother I still wear his ring. If I do not return, remember I loved you. None of these letters were sent. They stayed hidden in pockets of the dead, buried beneath rubble, washed away by time, but their words still echo, whispers from men who wanted to be seen, to be missed, to be remembered, the slaves who fought. Not all Roman soldiers were free. Rome conscripted slaves, prisoners, foreigners, threw them into front lines with dull blades and no armour. Fight and you may be free, they were told. They fought, and most of them died. Those who lived were used again, and again, until they broke. Rome did not build its empire with courage. It built it with bodies, and not all of them volunteered. The ones who regretted. They had killed, pillaged, burned villages, held screaming children at sword point. They followed orders. Rome first, they were told. Glory to the empire. But in the silence after war, some heard voices, screams that wouldn't fade, dreams that left them shaking in sweat, faces that wouldn't go away, and they regretted. But there was no forgiveness in Rome, no shrines for guilt, and no temples for sorrow, only silence, the ones who broke. Some didn't die, they shattered. They sat for hours staring at nothing. They spoke to ghosts, they laughed at rain. They forgot their own names. Rome had no word for it, no care. They were left in alleyways, outside baths, begging. War didn't take their lives, it took their minds. And the empire offered them nothing, the ones who refused. A few brave souls said, no. No to orders, no to cruelty, no to more killing. They were executed, quickly, quietly, because Rome had no room for conscience, no room for disobedience, no room for men who asked why. But we remember them, because they chose their soul over survival, their humanity over fear. They were heroes too, even if no monument says so. The veterans who came home. Some lived, 20 years of service, hundreds of battles, a chest full of scars. They returned home with nothing, no land, no pension, no fanfare. Some took jobs as guards, some drank themselves numb, some simply walked into the woods and never came back. Rome called them heroes, but forgot them the moment they stepped off the road. Why we must remember. It is not polished bronze and golden laurel crowns. It is not songs and statues and patriotic myths. It is human, brutal, lonely. The Roman soldier, like all soldiers, was not just a tool. He was a son, a brother, a friend, a man who once laughed, once cried, once dreamed of something better. He deserves more than silence. Here is an example of a Roman eulogy used for a soldier or soldiers who have passed in battle. Men of the 10th Legion, today we gather, not in triumph, but in memory, not to raise banners, but to bow our heads. One among us has fallen, and though Rome marches on, we do not forget our own. This man, Titus Flavius Cato, was born not of marble halls or noble blood, but from dust and toil, a son of shepherds, a man of the earth. He was not raised to command, but to endure, and endure he did. He held the line at Vindobona when the river turned red. He crossed the Danube on frozen blood. He marched through Gaul, through Germania, through lands where the sun never warmed the bones. He buried brothers. He carried the wounded. He never turned his back. He spoke little, but when he spoke, men listened. He laughed rarely, but when he laughed it brought warmth to campfires cold as iron. He feared no man, no storm, no blade, not because he was without fear, but because he bore it like armour. He took no wife, he claimed no land. His life belonged to Rome, and to us. In the end, it was not an arrow that killed him, nor sword, nor fire, nor the cruelty of barbarians. It was duty. He stood where others faltered, held fast when the line bent. He saw the charge coming and did not step back. One man among a sea of chaos, and he did not yield. They say the gods turn their eyes to moments like that. If they did, they saw a Roman. He is gone now. Not to the fields of Elysium, perhaps, but to the silence beyond the veil where all soldiers go. His name will not appear in marble scrolls. His statue will not stand in the forum. No poets will sing of him in perfumed theatres, but we, his brothers, remember. Let every man here know. In life, he stood beside you. In death, he stands above you. Let his name be spoken, not in the halls of the Senate, but in the mess tent, in the training yard, by the fire. Titus Flavius Cato, son of Rome, soldier, brother. May the winds carry your spirit. May Mars welcome you with honour, and may the earth lie light upon your bones. Sit tibi terra levis, may the earth be light upon you. Here is a reflective account from a Roman soldier. You've heard the stories of glory, haven't you? Of Rome the eternal, Rome the invincible, of triumphs, statues, golden eagles, and generals whose names echo through marble halls. But you haven't heard mine, because I was just a soldier, and Rome does not remember us. I wasn't a hero. I didn't lead charges. I didn't give speeches. I didn't wear purple or carve my name into monuments. I joined because there was nothing else. I was hungry. The recruiter said there'd be bread, coin, purpose. So I signed my name, or made my mark, really. I couldn't write back then. They put a sword in my hand, taught me to stab low, taught me to march until my feet bled, taught me to kill. They don't tell you about the nights, the freezing rain that soaks you through your cloak, the lice in your tunic, the smell of blood that never really washes off. They don't talk about the screams, or the looks in men's eyes when they know it's over, or the silence afterward, when all that's left is broken bodies and smoke. They celebrate the victories, but not the nightmares. I marched more than I fought, through forests so thick you couldn't see the sun, through deserts that turned your skin into cracked leather, through villages we burned because someone in Rome said they defied us. We walked until our knees screamed and our boots split and our souls dulled. Keep marching, they said. Rome depends on you. So we did, but Rome never marched with us. I remember every one of them. Decimus, who used to sing even when his teeth were chattering. Gone in Gaul, throat opened like a wineskin. Marcellus, who joked about retiring near Capua. He caught a spear in the belly. Took hours to die. Tiberius, he just disappeared. One day he was there, next day, gone. We found his helmet days later, covered in dried blood. I buried them when I could. When there was time, when there weren't too many. But sometimes I just walked away. What was I supposed to do? We had to move on. We always had to move on. No time to mourn in the legions, no room for grief in the ranks. There were orders, we followed them. We burned huts. We took what we needed, grain, cattle, people. We punished towns for resisting us. I told myself I was bringing order, that Rome was civilization. But at night, when the fire died down, I heard the voices of the ones we left behind. The children crying in the woods, the old man clutching a charred door frame. I obeyed, but that doesn't mean I was right. Some of us were slaves when we joined. Others were foreigners, Dacians, Numidians, Thracians, barely spoke Latin. We fought harder than the Romans sometimes, because we were promised freedom at the end, citizenship, a plot of land, a future. Some got it, most didn't. We were used, then forgotten, but we bled just the same. They said dying for Rome was glorious, but there's nothing glorious about coughing up blood in the mud, about crying for your mother while your guts spill out, about being buried in a pit with 10 others, no names, no prayers. No senators came to our funerals, no poets wrote about us, just a few comrades, too tired to cry, whispering, "May the earth lie light upon you." Then they moved on. I survived 23 years. I came back to find my wife remarried, my farm sold, my name barely remembered. They called me hero, but I couldn't sleep. Loud noises made me flinch. I saw my friends in shadows. I couldn't stop drinking. I didn't die on the battlefield, but something inside me did. We built the roads, we manned the walls, we fought the wars. We kept the empire alive with our bodies. And when we broke, Rome replaced us. We weren't senators, we weren't emperors, we were numbers, rations, meat for the front, but we were men. Not praised, not worshipped, just remembered. Tell my story, say my name, not for glory, not for honour, but because I lived. because I mattered, because I was more than just a corpse in the mud. I was a soldier of Rome. I marched, I fought, I bled, I endured. History does not carry my name, but I was there. If you remember anything of Rome, remember me. Not the generals, not the emperors, not the myths. Remember the dust-covered faces, the tired eyes, the calloused hands. Remember the soldier. Remember me. In the chaos of battle, when steel clashes and blood soaks the earth, the Roman soldier's heart did not beat to the rhythm of mere mortal courage alone. It thundered with the presence of gods, invisible, unpredictable, but ever watchful. The gods were not distant figures in marble temples. They were felt in every breath, every glance to the sky, every whispered prayer under the weight of armour and the roar of war. The gods, guardians, judges, and furies. Mars, the god of war himself, was the fiercest presence in the legion's mind. He was more than a symbol. He was a force to be feared and appeased. Before each campaign, generals and soldiers alike offered sacrifices and solemn vows to Mars, bloodied animals, smoke curling heavenward, seeking his favour to sharpen their swords and harden their hearts. But Mars was not alone. Bellona, the fierce goddess of war's frenzy, was called upon to ignite the rage and fury necessary to overwhelm enemies. Meanwhile, Jupiter, the king of gods, held the final judgment, his lightning a sign of divine approval or wrath, read carefully by augurs who watched the skies and flight of birds. No soldier marched into battle without invoking the protective spirits of the household, the Lares and Penates, or seeking the blessing of Fortuna, the capricious goddess of fate, whose smile could turn the tide or doom a legion to slaughter. Rituals and omens, signs from the divine. Roman commanders relied heavily on omens, the flight of birds, the entrails of sacrificed animals, or sudden thunderclaps to interpret the god's will. An unfavourable omen could delay an entire campaign, while a favourable sign would steel the men with a sense of destiny. Before battle, soldiers themselves performed rituals, touching the sacred standards, the eagle that represented their legion's honour, and murmuring prayers to the gods for protection. The loss of a standard was worse than death itself. It was a divine disgrace, a symbol that the gods had turned their backs. Divine presence on the battlefield. Roman soldiers believed the gods walked among them in the thickest moments of battle. Their courage was not just a matter of flesh and blood, but a communion with the divine. To fight well was to honour the gods. To falter was to risk their wrath. Some claimed to see visions of deities guiding arrows, turning the course of cavalry charges, or calling upon storms to scatter enemy ranks. Whether true or legend, these stories fueled the soldiers' conviction that their cause was just and their strength celestial. The price of divine favour. But the gods were merciless and unpredictable, a legion that overstepped, that grew too proud or neglected ritual, risked disaster. History is littered with tales of armies struck down by plague, betrayal, or sudden storms, all seen as punishment from the gods. The fear of divine retribution kept discipline fierce and obedience strict. To the Roman soldier, the gods were not just patrons, They were judges of loyalty, honour, and courage. So as the sword rose and the shield clanged, the soldier's voice lifted in silent prayer, a call for strength, for protection, for favour in the eyes of gods who demanded nothing less than total devotion. For in the shadow of the gods, the mortal soldier fought not just for empire or glory, but for survival of the soul. For the Roman soldier, death was never the end of the story. No, to those who marched beneath the eagle's standard, who bled on distant fields, the afterlife was as real as the sword in their hand. It was a realm of eternal honour, or a shadowed abyss, a final judgment awaiting beyond the veil of mortal life. The afterlife, a place of honour and rest. Unlike the grand heavens of later faiths, the Roman soldier's idea of the afterlife was complex, woven from the threads of pagan belief, myth, and superstition. They envisioned a place beyond this world where brave men might find a peaceful rest, a kind of Elysium, the blessed fields where heroes dwelled. Free from pain and toil, Elysium was not granted lightly. It was reserved for those who had earned their place through courage and virtue, men who had fought fiercely, lived honourably, and died with valour. To the soldier, the hope of Elysium was a light in the darkness of war. It was the promise that their sacrifices were not in vain, that even in death their spirit would march on, surrounded by peace and glory. Shades and spirits, the soldier's fear of the underworld. But the afterlife was not all light and honour. There was also the inferi, the spirits of the dead who had not found peace. These restless shades haunted the soldier's dreams, feared as angry ghosts who lingered in the shadows. To die dishonourably, to betray Rome or your comrades, meant wandering the bleak underworld, a place of torment and eternal unrest. The river Styx, ferried by Car and the grim boatman, marked the passage from life to death. Only with the proper rites, coins placed under the tongue, and prayers to the gods could the soldier hope to cross safely. The role of rituals and funerary practices. Because death was a journey as much as an end, Roman soldiers and their comrades placed great importance on funerary rites, a proper burial, a final salute, and offerings to the gods of the dead. These were sacred duties. They ensured the fallen's safe passage and protected the living from the wrath of unsettled spirits. Camps were filled with solemn ceremonies. The legion would sing dirges, and priests performed rites to honour the dead and comfort the survivors. Courage born from belief. This belief in an afterlife shaped how Roman soldiers faced the horrors of war. They fought with the hope that death was not oblivion, but transformation. That if they fell bravely, they would be welcomed among the honoured dead, their names sung by the living, their souls at peace in Elysium's fields. It was a comfort against despair, a fire that burned through the cold shadow of death. A legacy beyond life. So when you see a shattered helmet, a broken sword, or a forgotten grave, remember that beneath these relics lies a story of faith, of men who believed their courage echoed beyond their mortal years, They fought not just for empire, for gold or for glory, but for the promise that death would not silence them. I think now is a perfect time for a few moments of reflection of what we've just learned on this journey across the Roman Empire. But don't worry, we still have more to cover. Now, let's learn about their gear. Before he ever drew blood, the Roman soldier was already a weapon. From head to toe, every piece of his gear was a product of centuries of refinement, designed not only for survival, but for domination. The clang of metal, the creak of leather, the weight of war pressing on his shoulders. The Roman legionary didn't just wear armour, he wore the empire. Clad in iron and grit, the Roman legionary was not just a man, he was a machine of conquest, forged by discipline and wrapped in the empire's finest tools of war. His gear was the result of centuries of brutal innovation. Before battle, before the first cry of war echoed across the field, the soldier was already transformed. On his left arm, he bore the scutum, a towering curved shield layered in wood, bound in leather and rimmed with iron. It wasn't simply for protection, it was the foundation of the Roman fighting system. Together with his brothers, the legionary could form an impenetrable wall, a moving fortress that consumed enemy formations with mechanical precision. In his right hand was the gladius, short, plain and merciless. It was designed not for show but for efficiency. In the tight, disciplined ranks of Rome's line infantry, there was no room for wide, slashing strikes. The gladius thrust forward, quick and deadly, slipping between ribs or beneath shields. It was a tool, not a weapon of honour, meant to end a life in a heartbeat. Hanging from his belt was the pugio, a dagger of last resort. Soldiers kept it close, not just for battle, but for the silent, desperate moments where steel might be needed when words failed. Over his torso, the legionary wore the larica segmentata, the signature segmented armour of the Roman war machine. Strips of iron curved and overlapped across his chest and shoulders, offering solid protection without sacrificing movement. It clanked and shifted with each motion, but it was brilliantly engineered to absorb shock and deflect blows. Earlier soldiers wore chainmail or scale armour, but this was the cutting edge of imperial warfare. It gleamed in the sun like the skin of a beast built for battle. Upon his head sat the galea, a helmet of bronze or iron, fitted with cheek plates and a neck guard. It was crafted not only to protect, but to allow awareness. Roman soldiers were drilled to respond instantly to commands, so their helmets were designed for vision and hearing as much as defence. Some bore crests of dyed horsehair, especially for centurions or officers, standing out in the chaos so that men could rally to them. These plumes weren't decoration, they were signals, icons of leadership in a storm of chaos. His feet were strapped into caligae, rugged military sandals designed for the endless march. Reinforced with iron hobnails and thick soles, they carried soldiers across hundreds of miles of harsh terrain. Roman soldiers didn't ride into battle. They walked through mud, heat and snow. 20 miles a day was standard. These sandals were worn until they fell apart, then repaired or replaced. A soldier's feet were his foundation, and the empire conquered the world one blistered, bloodied step at a time. And then there was the pilum, the Roman javelin, 6 feet of wood and iron, designed to be thrown just before contact. When it struck a shield, its long iron shaft would bend and render the shield useless. The enemy couldn't throw it back, and they couldn't defend with it embedded in their arm or shield. It broke formations, it broke morale. It was psychological warfare in a single, elegant design. Strapped across his back was the sarcina, the soldier's marching pack. It held his cloak, food, tools, spare sandals, a pot, a hand mill for grinding grain, and everything else he needed to live and build. Roman soldiers didn't just fight. They dug trenches, built roads, constructed fortresses. They were their own supply chain. General Marius, who reformed the legions, had famously made them carry their own gear, earning them the nickname Marius's mules. It wasn't an insult, it was a badge of endurance. The Roman soldier was expected to be a builder, a survivor, a destroyer, all in one. All of this gear, the armour, the weapons, the tools, wasn't just equipment, it was identity. It was the empire reduced to steel, leather, and discipline. Nothing was wasted, nothing was ornamental. Every piece had a purpose. When the legionary marched into battle, he did so as a living instrument of the Roman war machine, one man among thousands, yet indistinguishable in rhythm, in will, in readiness. His gear didn't just protect him, it transformed him into a conqueror, into a symbol, into Rome itself. Without sounding contradictory to what I was just saying, all of that gear, the shield, the gladius, the armour, the endless weight of iron and obligation, it made the Roman soldier look invincible. From a distance, he was a walking fortress, part of a flawless, terrifying war engine. But inside that armour was a man, tired, blistered, hungry, haunted. The very tools that symbolised the might of Rome also symbolised its burden. He marched for months, carrying 90 pounds on his back, through rain, heat and blood-choked roads, knowing that when battle came, it would be up close and merciless. The gladius didn't swing wide and noble. It stabbed low, fast, into guts and groins and soft tissue. The shield wall wasn't a wall of glory, it was suffocation. It was your friend screaming beside you, pinned by arrows, crushed under formations that could not stop to grieve. The armour, for all its strength, didn't make you invulnerable, just heavy, just slower. And when you died choking on your own blood in a foreign field, the empire would roll forward without pause. Your name might be carved into a stone, if someone remembered. But more likely, you'd be buried in a shallow trench outside the camp, wrapped in the same gear that had failed to save you. That's why it was horrible fighting for Rome. Because beneath the iron and order, beneath the glory and conquest, was a machine that demanded everything. Your strength, your sanity, your soul, and gave nothing back but scars. They told them Rome was invincible, that the eagles would never fall, that the disciplined lines of the legion could overcome any foe, any terrain, any resistance, but they were wrong. And it was the men in the dirt who paid the price, because sometimes the legions were sent to die. There are names in Roman history whispered with dread, names etched into the stone of military disaster, not by the failure of courage, but by the failure of leadership. Arrogance, hubris, and cold indifference to the lives being spent like coin on foreign soil. It begins in the forests, the Teutoburg forest, 9 CE. 3 Roman legions marched through the thick, unfamiliar woods of Germania, nearly 20,000 men under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varus. They believed they were among allies, but they were walking into a trap. Led by a chieftain named Arminius, a man raised as a Roman auxiliary, the Germanic tribes launched a sudden devastating ambush. What followed was a massacre. Rain and mud turned the marching column into chaos. The heavy Roman gear that once gave them strength now slowed their every move. They were cut off, surrounded and slaughtered. It took days. Legionaries tried to form ranks to fight back, but the forest devoured their formations. One by one, they were hunted down. When it was over, not one of the 20,000 men walked away. Varus fell on his own sword. The legionary eagles, the sacred standards, were taken. It shattered Rome's illusion of invincibility and left a scar so deep the Emperor Augustus reportedly wandered his palace, crying, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." Then there was the Parthian disaster, Cari 53 BCE. The Roman Republic, under Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men in history, sought glory in the east. He dreamed of conquest, of outshining Caesar, but he underestimated the enemy. The Parthians were no rabble. They were masters of cavalry and archery. At Carrhae, the Roman legions, trained for close quarters, shield-to-shield warfare, were surrounded in the flat plains by waves of fast-moving horse archers. The sun beat down. The arrows never stopped. Roman shields were pinned in place. When they advanced, the Parthians retreated. When they stood still, they died. Crassus was eventually lured into negotiations and executed. His head was used as a prop in a Parthian play. The survivors, those not butchered or enslaved, wandered the desert in defeat, a humiliating end for men who had marched to claim an empire and found only ruin. The horrors weren't reserved for the forests or the deserts. Sometimes they came from within. The Jewish wars, especially the Great Revolt from 66 to 73 CE, were brutal, street by street, wall by wall nightmares. In Judea, Roman legions fought not just armies, but a population willing to die rather than bow. Siege warfare took a new shape, dragging siege towers through narrow valleys, hammering at ancient stone walls, only to face ambushes from rooftops, from tunnels, from hidden alleys. The defenders fought like ghosts, and Roman soldiers often became nothing more than walking battering rams, dying by the dozens just to move an inch forward. Jerusalem burned. The temple was destroyed. But victory came at a terrible cost for both sides. The legions left behind ash, famine, corpses, and a population that would never forget. Even in distant Britannia, the edge of the world, Rome found itself choking on its own overreach. The Battle of Mons Graupius, around 83 CE, and the decades of campaigns in Britain were some of the harshest in imperial history. Cold, wet and mountainous, Roman soldiers faced an environment that sapped morale and punished even simple movement. The Caledonian tribes didn't fight fair. They didn't meet Rome in open fields. They vanished into fog, struck from behind and slipped into the hills. Supply lines broke, discipline frayed. Men froze in their tents. Whole cohorts died without ever seeing the enemy face to face. Victory, when it came, felt like survival, not triumph. And when civil war came to Rome, which it did again and again, Roman soldiers found themselves killing other Roman soldiers. At Pharsalus, Mutina, Philippi, Actium, and 100 smaller, bloodier confrontations, Rome tore itself apart. Veterans of one campaign were ordered to destroy the very brothers they'd marched beside years before. They didn't fight barbarians in these moments. They fought men who wore the same armour, carried the same standards, prayed to the same gods. It was horror with a Latin accent. The death of unity. These weren't noble deaths. They weren't tales of clean, glorious victories to be sung over wine. They were slow, painful, often meaningless slaughters, where the brilliance of Roman military engineering was met by terrain, by cunning, by sheer desperation. And it was the legionary, the man in the armour carrying the weight, obeying the order, who died when Rome overreached. Because despite all the training, all the gear, all the discipline, Rome wasn't infallible, and when it failed on the backs of the men who had no choice but to fight. For all its glory, all its triumphs carved into marble and memory, the Roman Empire was not held together by pride or patriotism. It was held together by fear. In the Roman legions, you didn't just fear the enemy. You feared your own commanders. You feared your brothers in arms. You feared the cold, calculated punishment that lurked behind every mistake, every failure, every faltering step. The empire didn't just expect obedience, it demanded absolute submission to the standard, to the chain of command, to the machine of war. And if you broke that expectation, you paid in blood. The Roman military code was ruthless. For all the order it brought, it was built on cruelty. If a unit fled in battle, if it showed cowardice, or even if it failed to perform its duty, Rome responded not with lectures or leniency, but with decimation. A word we use casually today, but in the legions, decimatio meant something real, something horrific, a punishment so brutal, so psychologically devastating, it was used sparingly, not because it was rare, but because it broke men. The process was simple. A disgraced unit, whether it retreated, mutinied, or showed insubordination, would be lined up. The soldiers would draw lots, 1 in every 10 was selected, and then their fellow soldiers, their own comrades, were ordered to beat them to death, with clubs, with stones, with whatever they had. No executioners, no ceremony, just brother killing brother, for the honour of Rome. It was a message. Rome didn't need to punish everyone. Just enough. Enough to make the rest remember. Discipline was absolute. A Roman centurion, the hard backbone of the legion, carried not just a sword, but a vites, a vine staff, not ornamental, not symbolic. It was a weapon, used freely, often to beat discipline into the ranks. A legionary could be struck for speaking out of turn, for falling out of step, for letting his gear rust or his boots wear down too far. Respect was not earned, it was enforced. Commanders had nearly unchecked power. A general in the field could order executions on a whim for disobedience, theft, or even suspicion of betrayal. There were no appeals, no trials. The army was its own law. For the soldier, this meant walking a tightrope at all times. You were expected to be strong but not arrogant, brave but not disobedient, fast but never out of formation. Even success, if earned the wrong way, could be punished. Soldiers who acted without orders, even if victorious, could be reprimanded or worse. In the Roman mindset, discipline was more important than initiative. Control was more important than individual glory. This was not just practical, it was philosophical. The Roman military believed that unity, structure, and fear were stronger than inspiration. That one man's heroism meant nothing if it broke the line. And so the system crushed the ego out of its soldiers and forged them into obedient instruments. Even off the battlefield, the code ruled. A soldier caught stealing, gambling excessively, or sleeping on watch could be whipped, branded, or executed. In some cases, punishment extended to a man's entire unit. If one failed, all suffered. Camps had strict curfews, enforced drills, and regular inspections. Sloppiness was not tolerated. Discipline was not a state, it was a lifestyle. And in some ways, it worked. The Roman legions were feared across the world because they moved as one, killed as one, endured as one. They could build a fortress in a day, march 20 miles in full kit, then engage in combat without hesitation. No army before or since achieved their level of order, because no army dared demand so much from its own men. But the cost was immense. The soldier didn't just fight the enemy, he fought to stay within the machine, to not be noticed, to not be selected, to not be punished for someone else's failure. The stress was constant, the paranoia endless, and for the men who broke, or simply couldn't keep up, there was no forgiveness. Rome made no room for the weak. It consumed them, spat them out, and replaced them with someone new. That's what made fighting for the Roman Empire so uniquely brutal. It wasn't just the enemies, the terrain, the pain. It was knowing that if you stumbled, Rome itself would be the one to kill you. They called it glory. They called it duty. They called it Rome. But for the man who wore the armour, who stood beneath the eagle, who marched across the world into fire, mud, and oblivion, it was something else. It was fear, discipline, exhaustion, pain. It was punishment for failure, silence for sacrifice, and steel for a soul. These were not golden gods carved into marble. They were sons, fathers, strangers from distant provinces, pressed into legions, given numbers instead of names. They stood in shield walls, died in foreign mud, and were buried beneath stones no one now remembers. The wars they fought built an empire, but it was they who paid the bill. And what did they get in return? Maybe a pension, maybe a plot of land. More often, a shallow grave and a fading inscription on a forgotten milestone. The senators in white togas praised their victories, toasted their campaigns, but they never heard the screams, never stood in the formation, never watched a friend torn apart by javelins, never tasted the ash of burning cities while still holding the sword. Rome did not conquer with courage alone. It conquered with obedience, with brutality, with sacrifice. And behind every marble arch, every surviving ruin, every dusty museum relic, there's a man who never came home. He is not remembered in the songs, but he was there. That's why it was horrible fighting for the Roman Empire, not just because of what Rome asked you to endure, but because of how quickly it forgot you when it was done. History loves the victors. It sings of triumphs, of empires, of greatness. But it often forgets the hands that built those triumphs, the backs that carried the weight, the blood that paid for the glory. The Roman Empire stood for over 1,000 years. Its laws, its roads, its ruins still echo in our world today. But for all its grandeur, we must never forget, its foundation was soaked in pain, not just of those it conquered, but of those it used to do the conquering. We study emperors and senators, name cities after Caesars, marvel at aqueducts and colosseums. But the man in the dirt, the one holding the shield, kneeling in the rain, shaking before battle, he is the reason Rome endured. He is the one we must remember. Because the cost of empire is never paid by those who order the wars. It is paid by those who march into them. And when we look at any monument, any symbol of power, any nation that boasts of its legacy, we should always ask, who paid for this, and who was left behind when the cheering stopped? Rome was mighty, but it was also merciless. And for the soldier, Rome was not a dream. It was a burden carried in silence, carried in fear, carried to the grave. From Julius Caesar, reflecting on the cost of war. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. But behind every conquest lies countless untold sacrifices. From Tacitus, Roman historian. They endured hunger, cold, wounds, and death, not for fame or fortune, but because the empire demanded it. From Marcus Aurelius, emperor and philosopher. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. A call to courage, discipline, and sacrifice, even when forgotten. From an anonymous Roman soldier's epitaph, translated, I fought for Rome's glory, but none remained to tell my story. Well, dear listener, our time together through the past has unfortunately come to an end. However, if you liked our time together, consider subscribing and supporting the channel so we can do it again sometime. Bye-bye.